butcher and tavern owner, Harvard came to America in 1637, but died a year later at age 30, bequeathing his 400-volume library and half his considerable estate to the school. In essence, Harvard existed because of Hutchinson, as Harvard's own Peter Gomez wrote. Mrs. Hutchinson was the mother of New England's first and most serious theological schism. In debate, she bested the best of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's male preachers, theologians, and magistrates. And, as a result of her heresy, the colony determined to provide the education of a new generation of ministers and theologians who would secure New England's civil and theological peace against future seditious Mrs. Hutchinsons. Given her advanced pregnancy, the imposition of a sentence was delayed until the end of winter, and Hutchinson remained under what was essentially house arrest. After being excommunicated by her congregation, she and her husband Will, along with their children, some of their spouses, and 30 other families, left Massachusetts in March 1638 for the island of Aquidneck, in the territory of the Rhode Island colony, which had been purchased from the Narragansett Indians by Roger Williams, another renegade Puritan chased from Boston. The Hutchinsons and their followers founded a settlement called Portsmouth. In June 1638, Anne Hutchinson's pregnancy ended with the birth of a deformed fetus, not uncommon among older pregnant women. This unnatural pregnancy was seized upon by Boston's elders as further proof of her links with the devil, and that God was punishing her. After her husband's death in 1642, Anne Hutchinson moved with 6 of her children, settling in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. She was permitted to homestead there by the Dutch, who were more tolerant in questions of faith than Boston's Puritans. Dutch Governor Willem Kieft, already at war with local Indians, was happy to have more settlers, especially those he could place as a buffer in no man's land. There, fatally, Anne Hutchinson and her family got caught in the crossfire. In the heat of a late summer day in 1643, Anne Hutchinson's 9-year-old daughter was gathering berries in a meadow that overlooked what is now called Long Island Sound. The child probably dallied, and, as most children might, ate as many blueberries as she put in her basket. The last of Anne Hutchinson's 14 children born in England, Susan Hutchinson lived with her mother and extended family in what was then New Amsterdam, to be renamed New York when the Dutch capitulated to the British in 1664. The area in which the Hutchinsons were homesteading was later to be named after another early settler, Jacob Bronk. As Susan went about her work, she must have heard screams and seen the smoke rising from the direction of her family's homestead. There is no account of the child's reaction. Legends told in this part of the Bronx long afterward held that when the Siwanoy warriors found her, Susan Hutchinson was hiding inside the cleft of a large glacial boulder known as Split Rock. Her mother, other family members, and several servants all fell victim to the Indian war axes. Their bodies then burned in the conflagration as their farmhouse was torched. 15 in all died that day when a Siwanoy war party swept through the Hutchinson homestead. An Algonquian-speaking people, related to the Lenni Lenape, or Delaware tribe, the Siwanoy lived in the area between the modern Bronx and Connecticut, covering parts of Westchester County along Long Island Sound. Their attack on the Hutchinson farm was a reprisal for the massacre of a group of Lenni Lenape a few months earlier. It came during a 2-year-long conflict known as Kieft's War, a localized conflict foolishly begun by the Dutch governor. Incompetent and cruel, the heavy-handed Willem Kieft had allowed the prospering trade relations with the local tribes to sour and then turn disastrous. In a series of battles fought between 1640 and 1643, hundreds of Indians and scores of Dutch settlers had been killed. Ignoring warnings about the Siwanoy raiders, Anne Hutchinson had decided to stay put with their family. She had always enjoyed good relationships with Indians and was something of a pacifist. Since the time of the earlier Pequot War, fought in New England between 1636 and 1637, Hutchinson had argued against fighting with the Indians. As a leader of a scripture study group in Boston, she had convinced some of her male disciples not to join the militia force at war with local Indians, making them some of America's earliest conscientious objectors. But now, she was fatally mistaken. According to Hutchinson's biographer and descendant, Yves Laplante, the Siwanoy took Susan captive and their chief, Wampage, adopted her. Wampage also took on Susan's mother's name, calling himself An Hook from then on, for it was customary for a Siwanoy warrior to assume the name of his most illustrious victim. The neighboring land was called An Hook's Neck. The river was given Anne's surname, and so the modern highway beside it is the Hutchinson River Parkway. Following the raid, 9-year-old Susan Hutchinson spent the next 8 or 9 years with the Siwanoy, and, according to Laplante, is said to have left the tribe reluctantly. At 18, she arrived back in Boston, where her brother still lived, and married another settler a few months later. To the Puritan fathers back in Boston, the news of the Indian attack that resulted in Susan's capture and the death of much of her family gave great comfort. Indeed, one of their most heartfelt prayers seemed to have been answered. Longtime Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop remarked, "Thus it has pleased the Lord to have compassion of his poor churches here, and to discover this great impostor, an instrument of Satan, so fitted and trained to his service for interrupting the passage of his kingdom in this part of the world, and poisoning the churches here." Another Puritan minister, Thomas Weld, saw God using the devilish natives for his handiwork. "I never heard that Indians in those parts did ever before this commit the like outrage upon any one family, and therefore God's hand is the more apparently seen herein. To pick out this woeful woman, to make her and those belonging to her an unheard of heavy example of their cruelty above all others. Thus the Lord heard our groans to heaven, and freed us from this great and sore affliction." One affliction was relieved, but a much greater scourge remained. Every English man, woman, and child had heard tales of the great massacre of 1622, when Powhatans attacked a Virginia settlement, killing 350 colonists, a third of the population. In Virginia's early years, the losses were so profound that members of Parliament demanded an inquiry into what had become of thousands of British subjects. But colonial America's Indian problem exploded most dramatically and violently in Puritan New England. After the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1620, Native Americans had coexisted with the English in relative peace for some 15 years. During this time, the Indians had helped the first Pilgrims survive, as every schoolchild well knows. Trade with Indians was a significant part of the early New England economy, and many English settlers, carving out a life in the New England wilderness, had learned the value of such everyday Indian necessities as the canoe, moccasins, snowshoes, and maple syrup. But in time, relations between Indians and New Englanders soured. Many strands were woven into these ties, which were far more elaborate than the simplistic trinkets for wampum and peace pipe view once offered by school books in Hollywood. Of enormous import was the reality that there were many Indian nations, often divided by deep rivalries and ancient animosities. The first English to settle Massachusetts quickly grasped this truth and learned to play these intertribal rivalries to their advantage. The Pilgrims' alliance with Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag, for instance, was more than amiable friendship. The English understood that their firepower could help Massasoit overcome some of his traditional enemies. Welcoming the Pilgrims and joining the first Thanksgiving feast as a goodwill gesture, Massasoit knew all too well that the English advantages of cannon, musket, sword, pike, and powder could just as easily be turned on his people. Nor were the Pilgrims reluctant to demonstrate that they were ready and willing to use that force. In a raw display of violence, Miles Standish, the Mayflower's soldier for hire and military leader, although perhaps best known for his role in the fictitious Longfellow poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish, had once grabbed the knife of an Indian and slit his throat, a brutal demonstration of the English will to tamp down Indian resistance. As with almost all things Puritan, theology played a role in relations with the Indians. Of enormous importance to many Puritan ministers was the hope of converting Indians. The most vigorous Puritan missionary to the Indians, John Eliot, believed that Native Americans might be one of the biblical